Once in a German class, I was trying to explain to a couple classmates what happens in the Magic Mountain. So I said in broken German, it's so great, Hans Castorp and his friends go up to the sanatorium in the Alps and they have all these adventures. And another classmate broke in and said, falsch, überhaupt nicht ist passiert. False, absolutely nothing happens. And I laughed because that is equally true. Part 3, Section 1, The Shadow of Respectability. Case in point, something happens, nothing happens. So here's, plot-wise, what happens. Hans Castorp is afraid he's going to oversleep, but he doesn't. He wakes up when he should. He does his luxurious morning routine. He hears some music drifting in through the window or through the balcony. He surveys the grounds. He sees a woman walking in the garden, clad in black and looking sad. Then he hears his neighbors, who are a married Russian couple, having really loud sex, and spends most of the rest of the chapter, a long paragraph, trying to decide how he feels about it. Is he put out? Is he grossed out? Does he actually have any right to be prudish about it? And settling for something of all three. That Hans Castorp's attitude toward sex is something that we can already imagine from what we know about him is going to be a bit ambivalent, a person who has a kind of sympathy with creaturely pleasures, but also a person with a kind of a sympathy for the august. What's a person like that going to feel about noisy sex through the that he's hearing through the wall? Well, ambivalence of a sort that we learn about and which is going to be important for everything that follows. So far, so good. There's another thing, though, that we learn about in this chapter, which is how Hans Castorp feels about music. Let's take a look. Somewhere, morning music was playing. Muted chords of a chorale drifted toward him. A march followed after a brief pause. Hans Castorp loved music with all his heart, its effect being much like that of the porter he drank with his morning snack, profoundly calming, numbing, and doze-inducing. He listened now with pleasure, his head tilted to one side, mouth open, eyes slightly bloodshot. What's going on with the porter that he drinks for breakfast? That we have learned about in the chapter called At the Contemplates, Hans Castorp's moral state. So we learn that Hans Castorp was a healthy enough young person, but probably a little anemic from the start, or so Dr. Heidekind said, prescribing for him a nice daily glass of porter that is beer. If you go to a bar and order porter, that is a dark beer. It's like a stout. A nice daily glass of porter to be drunk with his snack when he returned from school. A robust brew, as everyone knows, because it's beer. Dark beer, which Dr. Heidekind believed helped build the blood, whatever that means. And which, however that might be, Hans Castorp discovered, much to his satisfaction, had a calming effect on his spirits, again, because it's beer, and pleasantly assisted him in his proclivity to doze, as his Uncle Tinapel put it, when he would sit with his mouth slightly open, dreaming away without a single firm thought in his head. This is important. This tendency, this stance of Hans Castorp's, where the attention goes inward or outward, or dialectically both, and the head falls to one side slightly and the mouth hangs open a bit. And he dozes without a single thought in his head. Or perhaps carried by thoughts to the point where thoughts leave. In the words of Keats, one is teased out of thought. Thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. Part of what I love about this chapter is that I think it's a great explanation of what it means for something to tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. And at that, I always wondered about that cold pastoral. Well, Hans Castorp is in what I might instead call a situation of the cold Barcarolle, because for him eternity is something that you get when music teases you out of thought, and you get when beer teases you out of thought. But these are not the only things. There is something about the water and the ocean that also has this effect for Hans Castorp, and we're actually going to learn a bit more later on about that in a chapter called A Stroll by the Shore, a fantastic philosophical meditation on time and eternity, which, talk about teasing us out of thought. My goodness. Cold Barcarolle indeed. Here then, we're going to look at how Hans Castorp is relating that trance-like state that he gets into, with the help of music, with the help of beer, with the help of the seaside, also with the help of those spiritual meditations on death that we saw him capable of even as a very young person in the chapter on the baptismal bowl, which, looking back at that chapter now, this is page 22. Actually, backing up to the previous page. Grandpa, little Hans Castorp might say, once they were in the den, raising himself up on tiptoe and stretching to reach the old man's ear. Please show me the baptismal bowl. So Grandpa takes the baptismal bowl down from its display case and shows the two pieces, the baptismal bowl and the silver plate that it sits on, shows them to Hans Castorp one piece at a time. So the bowl is more austere in its design, though it is filled with a golden lining. The plate is more ornate and has more carvings and information on it. There, on the plate, stood 1650 in ornate letters. The underside was inscribed in a variety of ever-changing scripts with the names of those heads of the household who had been its owners over the course of time. There were 7 names in all now, each rounded out with the date of inheritance. Hans Castorp's father's name was there, as was his grandfather's, and his great-grandfather's. And now that syllable came doubled, tripled, and quadrupled from the storyteller's mouth. And the boy would lay his head to one side, his eyes fixed and full of thought, yet somehow dreamily thoughtless, his lips parted in drowsy devotion. And he would listen to the great, 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 that somber sound of the crypt and buried time, which nevertheless both expressed a reverently preserved connection of his own life in the present to things now sunk deep beneath the earth, and simultaneously had a curious effect on him, the same effect visible in the look of his face. So here again is the dreaming, the dozing, the music, the beer, the sense of eternity from the seaside, also the baptismal bowl, and the contemplation, the act of contemplating its oldness. The sound of the syllables, the repeating great, 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 which in German is Ur, Großvater. Großvater is grandfather. Urgroßvater is great-grandfather. And so the farther you go back, you get more Ur. Ur is that primal syllable, that primal morpheme that we borrow in English as well for the meaning Urtext, Urfaust. Back and back and back into history, toward an origin that is lost. At the sound of those somber syllables, religious feelings got mixed up with a sense of death and history, and all of it together somehow left the boy with a pleasant sensation. Indeed, it may well have been that it was solely for the sake of that sound, just to hear it and join in reciting it, that he had once again asked to be allowed to see the baptismal bowl. And after the recitation, grandfather tells the story of the bowl that he has told many times, and has recited the tale of the baptism of one Hans Castorp, Hans Lorenz Castorp, and Hans Hermann Castorp, after another, until we come to the present moment of Hans Castorp, his baptism, and then, years later, his boyhood looking up at his grandfather. So the baptismal bowl chapter says, "The boy looked up at his grandfather's narrow grey head, which was bent over the bowl again, just as it had been in that long-vanished hour he was talking about. And a familiar feeling stole over him, a strange, half-dreamy, half-scary sense of standing there, and yet being tugged away at the same moment, a kind of fluctuating permanence that meant both a return to something and a dizzying, everlasting sameness, a feeling that he knew well from previous occasions, and that he had been waiting for, hoping it would touch him again. It was partly for the sake of that feeling that he had contrived to have this abiding, mutable heirloom shown to him." So this is twice within about as many pages that we are told that part of the reason Hans Castorp enjoys being shown this ancestral heirloom is because it gives him this kind of dizzying, wobbly, disorienting, but also, I think I dare say, sublime, profound sense of eternity. It doth tease him out of thought. Hans Castorp's capacity for that teasing out of thought, the way that energy is elicited in him by booze, by atmosphere, by environment, by the sense of history and the thought of eternity, and also by music. All of this is going to be important as we go along. Thanks for sticking with me.